That's what one German prisoner whispered on the day the gates finally opened, and it wasn't a dramatic line for the cameras. It was the simplest way to explain something the world still wasn't ready to hear. Freedom had arrived, but his body didn't believe it yet. His back, his legs, his lungs, his nerves, everything had learned pain as a language. And what he and other German homosexual prisoners did not expect was what would happen next when American Navy captains and Navy officers stepped into their world. Because this story isn't just about rescue, it's about the shock of realizing that liberation doesn't always mean safe. It's about how a single sentence in a law book could keep a man trapped even after the war ended. And it's about the moment American Navy captains looked at men marked as criminals and decided whether they were going to follow paperwork or follow conscience. Before we go there, I need you to hold one image in your head because it explains why sitting hurts became more than a complaint. Picture a man who hasn't sat down properly in months, maybe years, because sitting meant roll call, punishment, waiting, being watched. Standing meant control, walking meant survival, lying down meant danger. So when the world finally changes in one morning, his first instinct isn't to celebrate. It's to ask quietly if sitting is allowed now, and whether sitting will hurt him again. In Nazi Germany, there was a legal weapon that didn't require a battlefield to destroy lives. Paragraph 175 of the German Criminal Code criminalized sexual relations between men, and under the Nazis it was tightened and enforced brutally. Thousands of men were arrested. Many were sent to prisons and concentration camps and were forced to wear the pink triangle, a marker that made them targets not only for the regime, but often for the hatred of other prisoners too. The important part is this. In the logic of the time, these men were treated as criminals first and human beings second. That label followed them everywhere, even to the moment the war collapsed. Now fast forward, early 1945. Germany is breaking, the Allies are pushing in, camps are being discovered, and inside those places there are people who are barely recognizable as the people they used to be. The war is ending, but for them, the war has been every day. When American forces arrived at camps like Mauthausen, they didn't just find victims. They found evidence. They found survivors. They found scenes that demanded witnesses. One of the details that often gets forgotten is that not every American on those scenes was an army infantryman. There were Navy and OSS personnel involved in intelligence and documentation in Europe, including figures like U.S. Navy Lieutenant Jack Taylor, who survived imprisonment and later testified about what he witnessed. That matters here, because it sets up the human contradiction at the center of our story. The American Navy was not supposed to be in that place in the way most people imagine the Navy, and yet there were American Navy officers there looking at a system of cruelty up close, deciding what to do with the living. So imagine this moment. A group of prisoners is told, in a language they barely trust, that the Germans are gone and Americans are here. Some men cry, some can't. Some don't move at all, because movement has been punished for too long. And among them are German homosexual prisoners, men who learned to survive not only brutality, but also stigma. Even in a place full of suffering, they were often shoved to the bottom, blamed, mocked, treated as disposable. This is where the story gets tense, and where German homosexual prisoners did not expect this from American Navy captains becomes a real question. Because what would you expect if you were them? You might expect indifference. You might expect disgust. You might expect that an American uniform means freedom, but only for certain people. You might expect that your pink triangle is still a target, even when the flag changes. And if you've studied the post-war reality, you know the cruel twist. For many men targeted under paragraph 175, persecution did not magically end in 1945. In parts of post-war Germany, the law remained on the books for decades, and men convicted under it could still be treated as criminals. In some cases, survivors were forced to continue serving sentences after the war, or were denied recognition as victims for a long time. That's not a rumor. That's documented history. The world said never again, while a piece of paper kept saying guilty. So here's the fork in the road. The moment where an American Navy captain or officer could become the difference between rescued and returned. Because the Allies, when they arrived, were dealing with chaos. Thousands of displaced people, collapsed administrations, competing jurisdictions. And on top of that, the legal status of prisoners wasn't always simple. Some were imprisoned purely for who they were. Some had mixed charges. Some had paperwork that looked official, because in the Nazi system, cruelty wore the mask of legality. Now picture an American Navy captain standing with a translator. There's a list in someone's hand, names, categories, political prisoner, Jewish prisoner, forced laborer, criminal, and then something like 175, a number that doesn't look like a human being. The prisoner hears the number and feels his stomach drop because he knows what it means. He knows that the Nazis called him a criminal. He knows that the pink triangle wasn't just fabric, it was a verdict. And he wonders if the Americans are about to agree with the verdict. This is where the title's shock lives. German homosexual prisoners did not expect to be judged again on the day they were finally seen. But some American Navy captains and officers did something that in that environment was not guaranteed. They looked past the category and looked at the person. Not every Allied unit did this the same way, and the truth is complicated. There were liberators who were heroic and liberators who were cold. There were policies and there were exceptions. There were moments of compassion and moments of bureaucracy. That's exactly why this story matters, because it's not a clean Hollywood ending. It's a moral stress test. In some documented accounts of post-war treatment of men convicted under paragraph 175, survivors describe the humiliation of being told, in effect, "You are not a victim like the others." Imagine hearing that after surviving a camp. Imagine being told you're not eligible for the same protections because the law still sees you as a criminal. Imagine being denied help because the paperwork says so. Now bring that back to the camp gate. The prisoner is offered food, water, medical attention. He's barely able to sit. Sitting hurts. Everything hurts. And he hears a conversation that sounds like his life being decided again. Where will you go? What will happen to you? Who will you be handed to? This is where a particular kind of American presence mattered. Some Navy and OSS personnel were trained to observe systems, to notice patterns, to document what was happening, and to ask uncomfortable questions. And when you're that kind of person, you don't just see a man as case 175. You see a regime that used laws as weapons. You see how legal can be evil. So what could an American Navy captain do in that moment? He could insist on immediate release into displaced persons' care rather than returning someone to a local authority that might re-imprison him. He could refuse to treat paragraph 175 cases as ordinary criminals. He could push back against the idea that the law is the law, when that law had just been used to justify a campaign of persecution. He could use his authority to buy time, to create ambiguity, to put a human shield between a survivor and the next machine that wanted to grind him down. And for the prisoner, that kind of intervention would feel unreal, because it wasn't just help, it was recognition. Recognition is a strange kind of freedom. It's the moment someone looks at you and says, without needing a speech, "I understand what they did to you was wrong." For a German homosexual prisoner, after years of being treated as shame, that recognition could be the first true breath of air. But don't mistake this for an easy rescue. Even when an American officer did the right thing in one moment, the world outside the camp was still full of old ideas. The stigma didn't vanish with the Nazis. The law didn't evaporate overnight. Families didn't always welcome survivors back. Some survivors stayed silent for decades because speaking meant risking arrest or social destruction. That silence is one reason so many people don't know this story. And yet, the phrase, "sitting hurts," captures something universal. Even when the cage opens, the body remembers. Let's make this personal without making it sensational, because this is not entertainment built on pain. Think of the prisoner's mind like a locked room. For years, he learned that attention is danger, that standing out is punishment, that being seen is risk. So when an American Navy captain suddenly speaks to him like a human being, it can feel terrifying. Not because kindness is bad, but because kindness is unfamiliar. There's a moment that survivors of many kinds of trauma describe. When you're finally offered safety, you don't know what to do with it. Your instincts are calibrated for threat. You keep waiting for the trap. That's why the small choices matter so much. A blanket placed on shoulders without judgment, a cup of water held out without hesitation, a question asked with respect. What is your name? Not, what are you? Not, what did you do? Just, who are you? If you've ever wondered how history changes, it's often not the big speeches. It's the tiny moments where somebody refuses to treat another person as a label. Now zoom out and let's talk about the wider reality, because this is where the shock deepens. The Nazis arrested around 100,000 men for alleged violations of paragraph 175, and thousands were sent to concentration camps. Many did not survive. And for those who did, the end of the war did not guarantee dignity. For decades afterward, many were not recognized as victims in the same way others were. Some had their convictions remain on record. Some were denied reparations. Some were shamed into silence. The war ended, but the punishment echoed. So when you see a title like "German homosexual prisoners did not expect this from American Navy captains," the "this" isn't just one action. It's a moral collision. The collision between a system that said criminal and an individual who said human. Maybe in one camp, an American Navy officer saw the pink triangle and didn't laugh, didn't sneer, didn't look away. Maybe he asked a translator what it meant. Maybe he heard the answer and felt that cold realization. Even now, these men can be harmed again, just in a different uniform. Maybe he understood that liberation isn't complete if the old chain is still attached to the ankle. And maybe he did the simplest powerful thing a person with authority can do. He refused to cooperate with the chain. Here's why this matters for you watching today in the United States. Because the tempting version of history is the clean version. Good guys arrive, bad guys lose, victims are saved, credits roll. But real history is messy, and it asks uncomfortable questions. What happens when cruelty hides inside law? What happens when the war ends but the prejudice remains? What happens when the person who can help is not a saint, just a tired officer with a decision to make in 10 seconds? That's the moment that separates "I followed orders" from "I did what was right." And it's also why "sitting hurts" is such a brutal line, because it suggests the pain didn't stop when the gate opened. It moved inside, it became memory, it became fear of the future. Let's stay with that scene one more time. The prisoner finally sits down. His knees shake. He expects someone to shout at him. Nobody does. He expects someone to hit him. Nobody does. He expects someone to call him a name. Nobody does. An American Navy captain walks past, notices him, pauses, and instead of disgust, there's something like respect. Not pity. Respect. For a second, the prisoner isn't 175. He isn't a triangle. He isn't a rumor. He's a man who survived. Now, I want to be careful here. Not every American, not every officer, not every unit acted with the same understanding. History doesn't give us permission to pretend it was perfect, but it does give us evidence that some people recognize the injustice of paragraph 175 persecution, and that the post-war continuation of stigma and legal punishment was real And that's the lesson. Progress is never automatic. It has to be chosen moment by individuals and by societies. That brings us to the part that doesn't get enough attention, the long aftermath. Many survivors of paragraph 175 persecution didn't tell their stories publicly until very late in life, if at all. Some were afraid of rearrest. Some were afraid of losing jobs. Some were afraid of their families finding out. And because they were silent, the world built memorials that didn't always include them. History, in a cruel irony, almost erased them twice. In recent years, more recognition has come. Germany has taken steps to acknowledge and pardon victims of paragraph 175, and historians and museums have worked to include these stories more clearly in Holocaust education. But it took an astonishingly long time. That delay is part of what makes the liberators' small kindness so important. When the world doesn't validate your suffering, one person seeing you can feel like a life raft. If you're still with me, here's the question I want to leave sitting in your mind, because it's bigger than this story. If you were an American Navy captain in that moment with chaos everywhere and paperwork in your hand, would you have had the courage to treat legal as separate from right? And if you were the prisoner, would you have believed kindness was real, or would you have waited for the catch? Because that's the hidden damage of persecution. It doesn't just hurt bodies, it teaches people to doubt hope. Now tell me something in the comments, because I genuinely want to know how you see this. When you hear about German homosexual prisoners and paragraph 175 surviving the camps but still facing punishment afterward, what hits you harder, the original cruelty or the way the world kept the stigma alive after the war? And do you think most people today even realize that liberation didn't automatically mean justice? If you want more stories like this, told directly, with the uncomfortable parts included but without sensationalism, let me know what period of history you want next. And next time I write a script, I'm going to ask you again, which country is the audience, so the tone fits the culture and the way people actually speak? Because stories like this deserve one thing above all, to be told in a way that keeps the truth intact, keeps the dignity intact, and makes sure nobody gets erased again. Sources used for historical grounding: U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum on paragraph 175 and the Nazi campaign against homosexuality. National W-Tooth Museum material on U.S. Navy Lieutenant Jack Taylor and Mauthausen. Time reporting on why LGBTQ Holocaust stories were excluded and how paragraph 175's legacy continued after the war.